So first, a formal introduction. My name is Jeff Goldstein. I'm the Center Director for the National Center for Earth and Space Science Education. We oversee the Student Spaceflight Experiment Program. And on behalf of the Center and the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, welcome to the 9th Annual Conference. So thank you for coming out. I'm going to give what's called a keynote address for the conference. And a keynote is meant to set a tone for whatever happens over the next 2 days. And I think a good place to start, let me just get my clicker here. A good place to start is ask, has anyone been to the National Air and Space Museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C.? How many have not? If you've not gone, you really should take some time if you're in Washington for a while to go over there. This is one of the most visited museums, not just the Air and Space Museum, but this is one of the most visited museums on planet Earth. 8 to 10 million visitors go to this museum every year. And you're at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, which is an annex of the museum on the National Mall. So you are here in an annex of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. And this facility was built because there was simply no more space on the National Mall for all of the artifacts in the collection. And so one way to say it is that this building is bigger than the building on the National Mall. And this building is big enough to fit a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. This is a big place. And here you'll find an SR-71, a Concorde. You'll see the Enola Gay from a historical vantage point. That was the plane that dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima in World War II that brought World War II to a close. We also have one of the 3 remaining space shuttles here, Space Shuttle Discovery, and let me just kind of say something that's kind of cool. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has what's called the right of first refusal for any artifacts that NASA is trying to move to a museum setting. So if NASA doesn't need something historically significant, they, by definition, have to come to the Smithsonian and say, do you want it? And the Smithsonian has the right of first refusal. And so the first space shuttle that was built was called Enterprise, and it was simply dropped off the back of a 747. It never flew to space. They were looking at the aerodynamics of the vehicle. And once the shuttle fleet was built, Enterprise came to the Smithsonian as an artifact. But when the 3 shuttles retired in 2011, 2012, the question was, where were the 3 shuttles going to go? And Enterprise went to the Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. And the Smithsonian had the right of first refusal, which meant that it could pick the most significant of the space shuttles for its collection, which was Discovery. So the most remarkable of the space shuttles is in this facility here. It launched the Hubble Space Telescope, which gave us a whole new view of the universe around us. And for us to be able to hold the SSEP conference, for you, the next generation of American and Canadian and Brazilian scientists and engineers, is a remarkable honor. We are holding our conference at Discovery. So let me say that if you've got a museum like the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, which on some years is the most visited museum on planet Earth, there's got to be a big draw for that place. There's got to be a reason why that many people come to this museum annually. And the reason is that this museum, and when I say this museum, I'm not only talking about the mall, the mall building, but the building that you're in right now, the Stephen Udvar-Hazy Center. This museum is sacred ground with regard to dreams of human flight in air and space. It is sacred ground. That's what you're sitting in right now. And to really give you an understanding of that, I want to tell a couple of stories. And I think let me start by saying, if I could give you the power to fly, just by clicking my fingers, and all you have to do is this, you could fly around this room. You could go outside, you could fly around outside of the building. How many of you would want to do that? How many of you would want to do that? So some of you don't raise your hands? Seriously?
Hey, Jeff.
Okay, yeah.
It is a no-fly zone. Remember, we're on Dulles Airport property.
Okay, all right. So we have to make sure that you fly very low. But the point, though, is that if I gave you the power to fly, the majority of people would raise their hands. Why? Well, you answered the question really fast, so why would you want to do that? The power to do something that you can't do, the power to push the envelope, personal envelope. And if I were to go to any country on the face of this earth and ask a group like a family group or a public group or a student group, the same question, any nation on the face of this planet, what would they say? Same thing. And if I could go 2,000 years ago into the past and go anywhere on planet Earth and ask those folks back then the same question, what would they say? The same thing. And my point is that there are dreams that transcend national boundaries and transcend time. That these are dreams of the ages, the power of flight. And another way to say this, and I'm going to ask a question, I'm going to give you the answer so you see how the game is played, and I'm going to ask a bunch of other questions. Ready? So the question is, where do you come from? And the answer is your mom and dad. So where did they come from? Their mom and dad are your grandparents. And where did your grandparents come from? Their parents, your great-grandparents. And how far back does this go? How far back can I play this game? This is an audience participation situation. Tens of thousands of generations. Tens of thousands of generations. Now, how many of you know something about your great-great-great-grandparents? Raise your hands high. Very few. How many of you know something about your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents 10 generations ago? Almost nobody. In fact, nobody in this room. That's really sad. That's just 10 human generations ago. Just 10 human generations ago, and we've lost connectivity to our ancestors. We've lost connectivity to where we came from. But what's really kind of cool about this story is the tens of thousands of generations that gave rise to you are in you now. Because if they weren't, you wouldn't be here. Genetically, you are the product of tens of thousands of generations. And I can tell you that your ancestors, tens of thousands of generations ago, may have gone out on a nice day on a grassy field and looked around and saw birds flying in the air and dreamed, what would it be like to fly like those birds? What would it be like to have that freedom to fly above earth and look down? Your ancestors had those dreams. And when the sun set on that cloudless night, they may have laid down in that grassy field and looked heavenward and said, I wonder what it would be like to go to those points of light in the sky. I wonder what it would be like to go to the moon. And every generation embraced those dreams, and every generation added to the book of knowledge. And every generation, when it grew old, it said to the children, I have gone as far as I can with that dream. It's your turn to keep that dream alive. And be content in knowing that everything that I have learned in my generation, I pass on to you freely. And all of the knowledge that was passed to me from prior generations, I give to you freely. It's your turn, your generation, that is given the ability to take the human race where we've never gone before. And every generation kept that dream alive. Every generation added to the book of knowledge until finally on December 17th, 1903, and what did I do with my clicker? Wait a second. I'm interrupting the dramatic aspect of all of this. Okay, here we go. On December 17th, 1903, two bicycle mechanics had built an aircraft. What were their names? The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur. And for the first time in human history, a heavier-than-air vehicle carrying a human being with an engine for sustained flight and control surfaces to steer took to the sky. For the first time in human history, all of that hard work and sweat and toil over the generations paid off, because in 1903 we flew like the birds. And it was only a 12-second flight. It was only a 12-second flight, 120 feet. 120 feet is not much longer than the width of this room. It's a little bit longer than the width of this room. But it changed the world. We were never the same again because we flew like the birds. Does anybody know where the Wright Flyer, the first airplane that ever flew, lives? Where it is right now? It's at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. It's in the Mall building downtown. That's why there's so many people that come here every year. And then in 1927, actually, this is the Wright Flyer in its own gallery in the Mall building downtown. Then in 1927, if you look at the plane on the left, something remarkable happens. Does anybody know who flew the Spirit of St. Louis? Charles Lindbergh, and he was trying to win a prize. It was called the Ortig Prize. $25,000 was offered to the first person to travel travel across the Atlantic solo, nonstop. 6 people tried before Lindbergh. They all died. And Lindbergh did it. He took off from Long Island, New York. In that vehicle, it had so much gasoline in it, they weren't even sure it was going to lift off and clear the trees. And he flew to Paris, and he landed in Paris, and the world went nuts. Nobody had ever done this before. He didn't have a parachute. What's the point? It's extra weight. He didn't have a radio. What's the point? It's extra weight. And he was in this vehicle traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. And when he came back to the United States, 1 million people, let me say that again, 1 million people lined Broadway in 1927 and gave him a ticker tape parade. Why? Nobody had ever done it before. How many of you have gone to Europe on holiday or maybe business, and you get into a plane at whatever airport is local to you, and you take off, and you're crossing the mighty Atlantic Ocean at maybe 600 miles an hour. You don't possibly even look out the window much. You pick up the magazine in the pocket in front of you, and you do crosswords or read something. And you take the Atlantic Ocean moving under you at 600 miles an hour for granted. He was the first. And I'm going to come back to this photograph of Spaceship One in a second. With regard to traveling into space, who was the first human being to orbit the Earth? Anybody know? Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, in what year? 1961. Who was the first American to orbit the Earth? He was a former senator from the great state of Ohio, John Glenn. And he took off in a Mercury vehicle. This is him taking off. And at the very top is Friendship 7, his spacecraft. And let me get my laser pointer out. And here is a photograph of President Kennedy and John Glenn. Wait a second. That's a terrible photo. Okay, there's John Glenn, President Kennedy, looking into Friendship 7. John Glenn was in there for 4 hours and 55 minutes. He saw sunrise every hour and a half. He saw a sunset every hour and a half. He was only the second human being to ever look down on our planet from orbit. And so what's interesting is that this vehicle, well, it's a terrible picture. I didn't realize the resolution was so bad. But this vehicle is on the National Mall at the National Air and Space Museum. And then in 1965, Gemini 4 was launched with Ed White and James McDivitt. And Ed White was in this seat, and this seat over here, they opened up the hatch, and he got out. Moving at 18,000 miles an hour, he got out, and he was the first American to conduct an EVA, a spacewalk. And the only thing holding him to his lifeboat to go back home was this thin gold umbilical cord. And so you can see Gemini 4 at the National Air and Space Museum. And this one is really important to me And again, this all feeds into why is this museum sacred ground with regard to human dreams of flight and air and space. Now I'm an old guy, okay? I was a space baby. 6 minutes, really? I have 15 minutes left? Okay, that's good, okay. So I was a space baby. I was born in 1957. And I was 11 years old. I was born two months after Sputnik was launched, which was the first vehicle to orbit the Earth. And then when I was 11 years old, I was living in Uniondale, Long Island, and I was watching this black and white television set on a bunch of moving boxes because we were moving to the big city, we were moving to the Bronx. And on this black and white television set, I saw a human being in a bulky white suit walk down a rickety, what looked to be like a rather flimsy ladder, and for the first time in human history, put a footprint on another world. I saw Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the moon. And in that moment, I knew I wanted to be a space explorer. Is there anybody else that's as old as me that remembers that? Raise your hands. Very few. That's very sad. Very sad. And so the way that it happened was that in July of 1969, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary. July 20th is when they walked on the surface of the moon. In July of 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins went to the top of a 362-foot high rocket, a Saturn V moon rocket, a 36-story building that took off. And when they got into low Earth orbit, engineers at the Johnson Space Center looked at the telemetry coming back from the spacecraft to make sure that all systems were a go. And the astronauts were given a go for a translunar insertion burn, and they ignited their engine and they were off to the moon. And when they got to the moon, they went into orbit, and Michael Collins stayed in orbit in the command module Columbia. And Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong went into Eagle, which was the lunar lander, and descended to the surface of the moon. And then after they were walking around on the surface of the moon, and maybe I should say one other thing, back on Earth, you know, hundreds of millions of people were glued to their radios, watching television, and they heard those really fateful words, "The Eagle has landed." And it was, in fact, a pretty tense moment for landing because Neil Armstrong had to take over control last minute because they were heading for, the autopilot was heading them for a very large rock. So, you know, this had never been done before, and we were holding our collective breath. And I could go out in Uniondale, Long Island at 9 p.m. Eastern time and look at the moon 240,000 miles away and realize there were 3 people up there. And I knew I needed to be a space explorer when I grew up. So at 11 years old, I knew what I wanted to be, which was a gift and a blessing in and of itself. Well, this is the Columbia command module that carried those 3 astronauts to the moon and returned them safely to Earth. And here it is about a year ago, sitting on the floor of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the other building. It's not there now because it's actually traveling around the country for the 50th anniversary. And this is a Saturn V moon rocket on its crawler. Again, it's a 36-story building. A person is about the size of this, just like kind of like this. That's how big a person is. And here it is taking off. And this is what the surface of the moon looked like. Anybody want to go? And so, you know, one thing that I really want to say here is that 100,000 people built Apollo and made it happen. 100,000 people. That was the Apollo team. And it wasn't just the astronauts that went to the top and the rocket took them where the rocket was going to take them. They didn't have any control over that. It was 100,000 people standing behind the scenes. And every one of them was a child once that dared to dream. Everyone was a child once that dared to dream. Dreams are incredibly powerful things. And so, you know, the nature of history is kind of interesting. You're going to walk around this museum, you're going to see remarkable machines. And a lot of folks that come to these museums think that it's a history museum, so it's sort of like ancient stuff. But history doesn't work that way. History is alive and well. There goes another second. And there goes another second. And you all, as individuals, the next generation, have the power to jump into history at any time and take the human race where we've never been before. That's what's remarkable about history. You have the ability to change it. I didn't know when I was 11 years old I'd be standing in front of audiences talking about space exploration. That's a way cool concept for me. And so maybe one day in the future, somebody in this next generation, maybe an astronaut going to Titan, the moon of Saturn, or an orbiting space station, and you can come into the pit and talk at the National Air and Space Museum about what your experience has been. What's also kind of interesting is this continuum of human exploration. And every generation has dreams. Every generation is wedded to those dreams. Every generation adds to the book of knowledge in quest of seeing that dream come to fruition. And it's a continuum. In this moment right here, it's really special because this is the moment where the past intersects the future. Let me say that again. We are right now, in this moment, living at the intersection between the past and the future. We celebrate the past by reading about it, by listening to those that lived it. We celebrate the past. We learn about it in our textbooks, online. But in the moment, we have the ability to embrace the present. We have the ability to understand what opportunities are available to us to go after our own dreams. We have the ability maybe to even get involved in something called the Student Spaceflight Experiment Program and compete like professional scientists and engineers for having an experiment fly to low Earth orbit, to the frontier. And in this moment, we have the ability to inspire the future. We have the ability to change the way those in the present look at the future and look at how they want to live their lives, professionally and personally. Does everybody understand that continuum? So, does anybody, I'll finish this out with the rest of my personal story. Does anybody know who this is? Just scream it out. Who do you think that is? Neil Armstrong. Well, who was the first person to walk on the surface of the moon? Neil Armstrong. So, who took the picture here? Oh. Who is this? That's Buzz Aldrin. Neil Armstrong is taking the photograph as Buzz is walking down the ladder. And a number of years ago, not too far from here, in Reston, Virginia, this was before the Udvar-Hazy Center was built. And the space shuttle was actually just in a temporary storage hangar at Dulles Airport, Space Shuttle Enterprise at the time. Gina Ross was the principal of Buzz Aldrin Elementary School in Reston, Virginia. And I did a lot of work with schools at the time, and she called me up and she said, "Hey Jeff, my teachers are coming back in 2 weeks for the new academic year. The kids won't be back for 3 weeks. But we're firing up our teachers. And hey, can you come out and talk to all of the teachers at Buzz Aldrin Elementary School about science and learning and space exploration and human curiosity?" She wanted like the whole thing. And I said, "Sure, Gina, I'll come out and do that." And so I was talking to all of the teachers about how I got inspired when I was 11 years old when I saw Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the surface of the moon. And I was showing them this photograph. And what's really cool about this photo is that this was taken as Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were returning to the command module from the surface of the moon in the upper portion of Eagle, the lunar module. So Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are in here. And this photograph was taken by Michael Collins out of the window of Columbia, the command module. And what's way cool about this photograph is I'm in it. Look. I'm in the photograph. This is a picture of the entire human race, except for Michael Collins. This is a picture of the entire human race and what we're capable of achieving if we put our minds to it. And I guess because Michael Collins was not in this photograph, they made him the first director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. No, we didn't do that. But what was interesting is that this photograph was on the screen when I was talking to the teachers, and I remember this moment so vividly. The door opened up in the back. And the reason we knew that the door opened up in the back is because it was really squeaky. And we all looked back, and Buzz Aldrin walked in. Buzz Aldrin walked in. And what Gina had done is she invited him to his namesake school and didn't tell anybody. It was a big surprise. Well, my hero just walked in the room. And I'm supposed to be giving this presentation. And it's like, is that Buzz Aldrin that just walked into the room? So I kind of composed myself, and I'm trying to get through this presentation. But when he walked in and he sat down, he looked at this photograph and he said, oh, that's me and Neil coming back to Mike. Like, it was sort of like a family photo album. It's one of the most historic photos the human race had ever taken. And he looks at it and he said, oh, that's me and Neil coming back to Mike. And he sat down and he listened to what I had to say. And at the end of the presentation, he walked out of the room and the teachers just followed him. And I'm trying to process what just happened. And I'm pulling all my 80s stuff together. And I'm saying, that was Buzz Aldrin that just walked in. And I walked out into the hall. And all of the teachers were around Buzz Aldrin talking to him. He saw me. And he kind of made his way through the teachers, and he came over, and he gave me a two-handed handshake. So I've never met him. He's never met me. But one of those two-handed handshakes is sort of like, somehow we're connected. He gave me this two-handed handshake. And he said, Jeff, he must have asked who this guy was, because he called me Jeff. He said, Jeff, that was really inspiring. Where did that come from? That's what Buzz Aldrin said to me. And I didn't know exactly how to respond. This caught me totally off guard. I couldn't think. My hero standing in front of me asking me this really powerful question. And I just responded instinctually. I looked at him and I said, it came from you. Isn't that what it's all about? Isn't the mandate, the charge of every generation to inspire the next? That's why we're here. That's what humanity is all about. And if that's the case, then the Student Spaceflight Experiments Program is one way that we can all pass that forward to the next generation, to give you all the ability to be inspired and go where none have gone before. And we have high school students that graduated SSEP that are at Stanford, MIT, University of Chicago, you name it, because of SSEP. It was the focus of their college interviews. So I think the best way to end this is okay, and let me just kind of go through these slides really fast. This is the International Space Station when the Space Shuttle Endeavour was docked to it. We had experiments on Space Shuttle Endeavour. This is the vehicle, either if you're Mission 12, where your experiments were carried out, on a vehicle 250 miles above the surface of the Earth, moving 4.5 miles a second. And the astronauts were simply technicians carrying those experiments out. And if you're Mission 13 teams and your flight experiment teams, this is where your experiments are going, hopefully on July 21st at 7:35 p.m. Eastern Time from Kennedy Space Center. It's like, if it hasn't sunk in yet, okay, this is the real space program. And this is what it's like on an EVA in space. Anybody want to do this? Now, I really don't have time for that story. I'll tell it later at Family Science Night tonight. And by the way, Family Science Night, if you know people that you want to invite that don't know about it, we have plenty of room, and what we're going to do is go through the entire universe, which is like a big challenge, but I can do it. I've done it. So what I want to do is really turn it over to the next generation. I would like every student, before I say that, let me say one other thing. We get media requests all the time. Some outlets, some TV outlets, some media outlet will call up and talk to us about some community somewhere that is launching an experiment. They want to do a story, and they start out by saying, well, I hear that we have kids from this community I stop them right away. I say, these are not kids. I don't care if they're 10 years old, I don't care if they're in high school, they're not kids. They're microgravity researchers. They have to design an experiment against the engineering constraints imposed by a mini laboratory they must use, by the technology constraints associated with flight operations to and from low Earth orbit. They have to write a real proposal. They have to go through a formal two-step proposal review process, just like professional researchers. And those teams that get selected as the flight experiment have to go through 4 months of flight safety review at the toxicology office at NASA's Johnson Space Center, just like professional researchers. All the students participating in SSEP are microgravity researchers. That's how we view them. And I would like all of the microgravity researchers sitting here today to stand up. You are all potentially the next generation of America, Canada, and Brazil's scientists and engineers. So make us proud. Let me now have you all sit down, and let's keep going. All teachers and administrators and community program directors that supported this effort, please stand. We, the national team, can deliver national resources, but these are the folks on the ground at the local level that make the program possible. We're nothing without them. And are there any parents that are in here who haven't stood up yet? Please stand. You are all ambassadors for all of the parents that have participated, that have supported this program. 23,000 students participated in Mission 13 alone. So, and let me say one last thing about my staff. Stacy Hamill, our Senior Flight Operations Manager. Please stand, Stacy. John Apple, our Flight Operations Manager, is here somewhere. John, stand up. Kirsten Wheeler where's Kirsten?
I think she's still outside.
She's still outside. Kirsten is our Education Programs Manager. Kirsten. And I've had the pleasure of working many years with Michael Hulslander from the National Air and Space Museum, who is the liaison to everything we do with the Smithsonian, and we're very proud to be working with you. So I think I may be done. I hope that I've given you some food for thought. And we are going to reconvene in the space hangar for the conference proper. See you there.